Tonight we slip into misty Lochdubh, where sharp tongues, a dark lock, and half-buried secrets pull Hamish Macbeth into danger. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The mist came down softly over Lochdubh that morning, the thin, unsettled kind that blurred the edges of the cottages and made the loch look twice its size. Hamish Macbeth walked along the shore with Lugs trotting ahead, the dog's ears pricked as though the quiet itself had something to say. Hamish liked the early hour. No tourists, no Blair on the phone, no villagers needing help with hens or husbands. Just the cold air and the sound of water licking at the stones. It soothed him in a way he never admitted aloud. He pulled his old jacket tighter. The lining had long since given up, but it kept out the worst of the damp. Lugs stopped suddenly, turning toward the hill path that curved up past the MacRae sisters' croft. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. The house was just visible through the mist, its chimney cold and its curtains still drawn. "That's odd," Hamish murmured. The MacRae sisters, Morag and Elspeth, were always up at dawn, arguing loudly and without shame about whose turn it was to put on the kettle. Their voices were as much a part of Lochdubh's mornings as the gulls. Lugs whined, shifting his weight. Hamish gave his head a small scratch. "Aye, I know. We'll check soon enough." He continued along the waterfront, but the quiet had lost its comfort. The village felt wrong. Not in any dramatic way. Lochdubh rarely managed drama, but in the subtle shift that made Hamish's instincts stir. A window that should be open was shut. Smoke that should rise from a crofter's chimney was absent. Even the midges seemed hesitant. He crossed the small square toward Patel's shop. Patel stood outside, leaning on the broom he never used. His face brightened when he saw Hamish, then dimmed again, as though remembering something. "Morning, Hamish," he said. "You've not seen Morag or Elspeth, have you?" "No," Hamish said. "Are they not in?" "Not a sign of them. And you know what they're like. Never miss their morning post. Mrs. Wellington at the office has been muttering since 8:30, he lowered his voice. "Some folk think they must have had a proper falling out this time." Hamish doubted that. The MacRae sisters quarrelled every day and forgave each other before bedtime. Their bickering was just another Highland rhythm. A crofter, carrying a sack of feed, stepped out from behind Patel. "Heard they went to Inverness," he offered, though why they'd go without telling Mrs. Gallagher, I can't imagine. "She's been sour since she noticed the curtains shut," Patel snorted. "Mrs. Gallagher's been sour since 1962. Hamish felt the prickle again. "I'll take a look up at the croft." "Good idea," Patel said, though he sounded relieved Hamish was doing it instead of him. Hamish walked up the hill, the mist thickening as he climbed. Lugs went ahead, tail stiff. The MacRae croft sat on the slope, its roof damp and its windows dark. Hamish knocked once, then again harder. No answer. He lifted the latch gently. It wasn't locked. Inside, the cold hit him first. No fire in the grate, the peat basket untouched. A single teacup sat in the sink with a ring of tea around its base. One of the sisters must have drunk it yesterday morning. A scarf lay on the floor near the chair. Morag's, he thought. She always wore the garish tartan one that clashed with everything she owned. It looked as though she had dropped it halfway through, wrapping it over her shoulders. Hamish stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. Even the house had a different silence to it, one that made the back of his neck prickle. He walked through the small sitting room, careful not to disturb anything, though the sisters would hardly have noticed if he had. They lived in clutter. Newspapers from the early 90s, knitting projects abandoned in mid-row, biscuit tins without lids. Today, the disorder felt frozen rather than lived in. Lugs padded to the back door and sniffed, hackles lifting. Hamish crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't bark. He simply stared, nose pressed to the lower crack of the door. Hamish opened it and stepped out into the croft garden. The earth was damp, showing a scatter of boot marks. He couldn't tell if they were fresh, but he bent to look anyway. The soil had been disturbed more recently than the weather would suggest. One set of prints led toward the moor path. Before he could follow them, the shrill ring of his landline broke the quiet from the doorway. He sighed. Only one person would call at that hour. He hurried inside and grabbed the receiver. "Aye?" Blair's voice came out sharp, as though trying to bite through the phone line. "Macbeth, you've not turned in the forms for last month. Daviot's breathing down my neck. Where are you?" "Busy," Hamish said. "Doing what?" "Your report says you handled sheep worrying complaints yesterday. That's finished." Hamish looked at the cold hearth. "More sheep. They're restless." "There are no restless sheep," Blair snapped. "Quit skiving and get into Strathbane." Hamish kept his voice mild. "I'll send the forms later." "You'll send them now." Hamish hung up. Lugs looked up at him approvingly. "We'll not go to Strathbane today," Hamish said, rubbing the dog's ear. "Whatever's going on here matters more than paperwork." He stepped out again, studying the boot prints. The mist had thickened into a light drizzle, enough to blur the edges of the marks. He followed them a few paces, but they faded quickly. He turned back to the croft and scanned the doorway, the windows, the path. There was no sense of struggle, but neither did anything feel right. The quiet of the house still hung on him, heavy and unnatural. He walked back toward the village, stopping at the post office. Mrs. Wellington peered at him from behind the counter, her expression sharp. "You've been up there," she said. "Aye," Hamish replied. "Well?" She leaned forward. "Everything as usual?" "No," he said softly. That was enough. Mrs. Wellington straightened, her mouth tight. "I knew it. They never miss a morning. Did they pick up anything yesterday?" "No, not a scrap." He thanked her and left before the questions could start. He didn't want the whole village descending on the croft. Not yet. As he walked back up the path, Lugs suddenly froze, ears back. The dog's body stiffened, and a low sound rose in his throat. Not a bark, not a threat, but a warning. Hamish stopped. The drizzle fell in fine cold threads, and the mist swirled as though stirred by someone invisible. He listened hard. Nothing. "What is it?" he murmured. Lugs stepped to the edge of the garden, staring toward a cluster of dark bushes beside the croft. His growl deepened. Hamish narrowed his eyes, but he saw nothing except the movement of leaves in the damp air. The feeling of wrongness pressed in again. "We'll look into it properly," he whispered, "but not alone." Lugs stayed fixed on the bushes, refusing to move until Hamish touched his collar and gently pulled him away. As they walked back down the hill, Hamish felt the dog glance behind them more than once. Whatever Lugs had sensed, it wasn't gone. The drizzle had worked itself into a steady, needling fall by the time Hamish Macbeth made his way back up the hill toward the MacRae croft. It clung to his hair and soaked the shoulders of his old jacket, but he barely noticed. Lugs padded beside him, ears flattened against the damp. The world had that muffled sound it took on when the clouds pressed low, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Hamish had stopped by the post office first. Mrs. Wellington, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, had been locking up for her mid-morning tea when he caught her. "They've not been in," she told him before he could ask. She looked offended by the very idea. 40 years they've collected their post before 10. Rain, shine, flu or funeral. And today, nothing. Hamish had invited her, gently, to walk with him to the croft. She'd come without protest, though every few steps she muttered something under her breath about disruptions of routine and the end of civilization. Now she huffed up the slope behind him, clutching her cardigan closed against the wind. "I don't like this," she said. "Not at all." Hamish didn't either. The mist smeared itself over the windows until the croft looked blind. The door stood shut, but the feeling of wrongness pressed out from the walls, like cold air. Inside, nothing had changed since his earlier visit, and that was somehow worse. The room still held the stale chill of a night without a fire. The unwashed teacup remained in the sink. The scarf lay on the floor, where it had fallen. Mrs. Wellington took it in at a glance and went rigid. "They've not been home since yesterday," she whispered. "That's not right. Those two never leave before the kettle's boiled." Hamish crouched by the small table. A tin of barley sat on its side, its contents spilled in a loose arc over the flagstones. The sisters might have been untidy, but they didn't waste food. Nearby, a letter lay half-written, the pen marking a small dried blot, where someone must have paused mid-word. "A matter we can no longer keep quiet." He felt a faint chill at the base of his spine. "Did they mention anything to you?" he asked. Mrs. Wellington shook her head. only that they'd been sorting old papers. You know how they hoard. Hamish moved to the corner where a stool lay overturned. It looked as though someone had stood, reached for something, and been startled enough to knock it over. Or pushed. But there were no signs of violence, no smashed crockery, no marks on the floor. Just small things out of place, enough to trouble the instinct he trusted more than any bit of Strathbane procedure. A low growl came from the doorway. Lugs stood staring toward the back of the croft, hackles rising slowly like bristles lifted by static. Hamish touched the dog's neck. Steady! He moved through the rear door into the garden. Rain slicked the grass, leaving dark patches where soil had been disturbed. Footprints again. One set heading toward the moor path. Only one pair of boots was missing from the row by the wall. Morag always wore the black pair, Mrs. Wellington murmured. Elspeth hated those, said they made her feet look like boats. Only the black pair's gone, Hamish said quietly. Mrs. Wellington gave a thin, frightened breath. Hamish followed the prints a short way up the moor path, Lugs straining against his lead. The heather lay bedraggled from the rain, and small white tufts clung to wet bracken where wool had snagged. The air smelled of peat, damp soil, and something faintly metallic. Lugs pulled sharply left. "What is it, boy?" The dog whined, then darted forward, dragging Hamish through a patch of sodden heather. A dark shape lay half submerged a few yards off the path, its edges blurred by rain and mist. At first glance it looked like an abandoned coat. Hamish's chest tightened. He stepped closer. Elspeth MacRae lay on her side, one arm bent under her, the other stretched toward a tuft of gorse. Her hair, usually pinned up firmly, had fallen loose in the rain. Her face was pale, her mouth slack, her eyes half open, as if surprised by something she'd seen at the last moment. Mrs. Wellington gasped and clapped a hand over her mouth. Hamish knelt, the cold seeping through his trousers. There were no obvious wounds, no blood, nothing to suggest a struggle. Her boots, Morag's boots, he realised, were caked in mud. "She didn't fall here," he said softly. "Not like this." Mrs. Wellington nodded, tears appearing without fuss. Elspeth was sure-footed as a goat. Hamish touched Elspeth's hand, cold, rigid. She'd been dead for hours. He looked around, scanning the ground. Small indentations marked where someone else had stood. The rain had blurred them, but not enough. He could see the angle. Someone had been facing her. "Where's Morag?" Mrs. Wellington whispered. Hamish didn't answer. Instead he stood and gently guided her away before more of the village came trampling through. But it was too late. Word had already run downhill the moment they'd stepped through the croft door. Lochdubh gossip travelled faster than police cars. Within minutes people arrived in small anxious knots. Angus MacLean, cap pulled low. Mrs. Gallagher, arms folded, her expression sharpened with self-importance. Two fishers, a crofter's wife, all talking at once. Was it the moor? Dangerous place. I told them those boots were too old. She must have gone looking for Morag. Maybe they had a fight at last. Hamish held up a hand, but they steamrolled over him with their theories and reassurances. No one stopped long enough to consider facts. Villagers rarely did. Lugs barked once, sharp and warning. That, at least, brought silence. "Go home," Hamish said gently. "There's nothing more to see." But they lingered, nervous and curious, none wanting to be the first to retreat. Then Blair's voice cracked through the mist like a crow's call. "Macbeth!" He came stomping up the path in an ill-fitting waterproof coat, Anderson trailing behind him like a small, anxious shadow. Blair's face was already blotchy with irritation. "What have you meddled with now?" Blair demanded. "You're supposed to report this sort of thing." "I just did," Hamish said mildly. He hadn't, but Blair never needed the truth if it embarrassed him. Blair pushed past him and bent over the body. He made a show of inspecting it, though he barely glanced for more than a second. "Clear accident, case closed." Mrs. Wellington made a disgusted sound. Blair turned on her instantly. "And you? Don't you be interfering." "Interfering," she said coldly. "Would be you, Inspector." Blair ignored her. He turned back to Hamish. "Morag's probably wandering daft somewhere. You'll organise a search party and stop playing detective." Hamish met his glare calmly. "Morag didn't walk off by choice." "Oh?" Blair sneered. "You've psychic powers now?" No, Hamish replied. Just eyes. Blair flushed with anger, but before he could respond, thunder growled across the moor. The storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke, sending cold sheets of rain across the hillside. Villagers scurried back toward shelter, muttering. Blair barked at Anderson to fetch the van, though Anderson was already slipping on the wet grass. As Strathbane took over, Hamish stepped aside, unnoticed. He was used to being dismissed. Blair liked his cases neat. Hamish preferred them true. He returned briefly to the croft, Mrs. Wellington following reluctantly. Rain hammered on the roof as he surveyed the small disruptions once more, the spilled barley, the overturned stool, the incomplete letter. Morag had been writing something they could no longer keep quiet. Someone else had come in. Someone hurried, upset, or determined. Hamish crouched near the table, running a finger over the half-written page. Morag had always kept diaries, notebooks, scraps of paper stuffed behind cushions and under teapots. If something important had happened, she would have written it down somewhere. "We'll find it," he murmured. "Find what?" Mrs. Wellington asked. Whatever she meant. He scanned the room again. Nothing obvious. But Morag never trusted plain sight. She hid things out of habit. Lightning flashed outside, and thunder rattled the crockery on the shelves. The storm had truly arrived. Mrs. Wellington tugged her cardigan close. "I should get back. I've left the post office open." Hamish nodded. "Go on, I'll lock the door." When she had gone, Hamish lingered a moment, feeling the old croft settle around him. The MacRae sisters had filled it with noise and gossip. Without them, it felt hollow. He closed the door and headed back out into the storm, with Lugs at his side. The dog kept glancing behind them, as though expecting someone to follow. Hamish walked toward the village, rain falling in relentless sheets, his mind working quietly. The sisters' quarrel 3 days earlier, overheard outside Patel's shop. The smug, well-dressed newcomer staying at the hotel, asking questions no tourist had any reason to ask. Morag's letter mentioning something they could no longer keep quiet. Small things. But small things mattered in Lochdubh. They were the threads that, when tugged, unravelled whole lives. At the foot of the hill, Hamish paused to look back. The croft sat against the dark moor, a lonely shape under the bruised sky. Lugs gave a soft growl, not aimed at anything visible, but at the feeling that clung to the place. Hamish felt it too. Something small, old and dangerous had stirred, and it was nowhere near finished. The fog had thickened overnight, not the drifting, lazy kind Lochdubh often woke to, but a close, heavy blanket that smothered the village and blurred sound. Hamish Macbeth stood outside his police station cottage with a mug of tea cooling in his hands, watching the grey press against the lock until water and sky were one colourless sheet. Lugs nudged his knee impatiently, wanting to set out. The dog disliked fog. It made it harder to see what needed warning about. "Aye, we'll go," Hamish murmured, setting down the mug on the windowsill, where it would be forgotten until the midges found it. His boots squelched on the wet ground as he crossed to the road. That faint sense of something unsettled, something out of tune, followed him like a second shadow. Elspeth dead. Morag missing. Blair insisting it was an accident before he'd properly looked. The fog felt like it had crept in to hide answers. Lugs took the lead, as he often did when Hamish was lost in thought, trotting ahead with his nose low to the earth. The village was waking reluctantly. Curtains twitched. Someone's hen clucked a complaint from a nearby yard. A crofter's old collie let out one half-hearted bark at the sound of Hamish's steps. He made his first stop at the Curry sisters' house. Angela and Martha answered together, like a two-headed creature sharing one suspicion. They ushered Hamish inside without asking what he wanted. They both had their hair wound into matching curlers, and both wore cardigans that had seen more winters than they cared to admit. "We knew you'd be here," Angela said, kettle already on the hob. "Terrible business," Martha agreed, shaking her head so violently her curlers clicked. Terrible. Hamish took a seat at the small kitchen table, Lugs curling beneath it with a soft sigh. The room smelled of toast and lavender polish. The sisters sat opposite him, leaning so far forward their noses were nearly in his tea. "Morag was here 3 days ago," Angela began, lowering her voice as though the fog might be listening. She said she had a burden on her mind. A great burden, Martha echoed. Hamish lifted a brow. Did she say what sort of burden? She did, Angela said. She didn't, Martha said at the same time. They glared at each other. Angela sniffed. She told me she'd discovered something about a family in the village, something troubling. Martha huffed. She told me it was about someone in the kirk, something she overheard in the vestry. Hamish took a sip of his tea. Did she mention any names? They shook their heads simultaneously. But she was troubled, Angela said. You could see it in the way she wrung her scarf. That awful tartan thing. She wrung it so hard she nearly tore it, Martha added. Hamish thanked them and stood to go. If you think of anything else, anything at all, send word. They nodded solemnly. Then immediately resumed arguing about whether Morag had spoken in a whisper or a mutter. Back outside, the fog thickened again around Hamish and Lugs. He walked toward Patel's shop, the wooden sign creaking softly in the damp air. Patel stood behind the counter, polishing a jar of barley sweets, with a cloth that had done more harm than good. You're looking for information, Patel said, before Hamish even opened his mouth. You've heard something? Only what half the village has repeated incorrectly. Patel set the jar down. But I did have a visitor yesterday. Tourist woman. Said she needed stationery. Hamish leaned an elbow on the counter. Plenty folk buy stationery. Not plenty folk. Ask an hour's worth of questions about Lochdubh families while buying it, Patel replied. She asked about the old Crofts. Who lived where? Who married whom? Who feuded with whom? I told her it wasn't my place to gossip. Hamish's lips tugged subtly. You told her nothing? Truly? Patel hesitated, then cleared his throat. I may have mentioned the MacRae sisters know a good deal about old family lines, and she wrote that down. He mimed the motion with stiff, exaggerated strokes. Very precise, like she was copying scripture. Hamish felt that familiar tug in his mind. She give her name? Said she was Mrs. Dalrymple, staying at the hotel. We get plenty folk asking daft things, but she had a look in her eye, like someone collecting pieces. Hamish thanked him. Patel looked relieved, as though handing the puzzle off to someone else. When Hamish stepped out again, Mrs. Gallagher was waiting, arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes narrowed to suspicious slits. She was a small, sharp woman with the particular talent of appearing wherever a hint of scandal drifted. I've something to tell you, she announced. Hamish resisted the temptation to sigh. I saw someone at the MacRae croft early yesterday morning, before light even. She leaned close. Tall figure, coat flapping in the wind, standing by the back door. Hamish considered this. Did you see their face? My eyesight isn't what it was, she admitted grudgingly. Fog was thick as porridge, but I know the shape of mischief when I see it. Hamish nodded slowly. Thank you. That might help. Mrs. Gallagher looked pleased with herself, which meant half the village would hear her version of the story before noon, and most of them would add details that suited their imagination. Hamish turned toward the moors. He needed quiet. He needed space to think. Lugs bounded ahead, eager to move. They climbed the slope until the village sounds faded, leaving only the wind brushing the heather and the soft squelch of soaked earth underfoot. The path that skirted the croft stretched before them, faint as a memory under the fog. Hamish crouched near a patch of mud where a track curved off the main path. The earth bore two sets of prints, one light and small, Morag's boots perhaps, and one deeper, as if someone had been supporting or half carrying another. He traced the direction with his eyes. They went this way. Lugs whined softly and nudged the edge of the track, then trotted ahead. Hamish followed, the fog curling around them like a blanket, trying to hide secrets. The trail wound toward the woods near the loch, then vanished at a washed-out ditch where the ground had collapsed in the recent rain. Hamish stood there, a long moment, letting the cold seep into him. His thoughts were brief, muted things, but they held weight. Morag had been led away, or pushed, and someone had taken care not to be seen. He walked to the edge of the ditch, scanning for signs. Nothing. The rain had erased whatever truth the ground once held. By the time he returned to the village, the air had shifted. Lochdubh felt restless, caught between grief and curiosity. With the sisters gone, Rumours had grown unruly. Their gossiping had been resented, but it had also ordered things. Now villagers whispered in clumps, uncertain how much to share or hide. Hamish saw the old habits rise, a man avoiding his neighbour because of a quarrel from 5 years ago, a fisher pretending not to notice his cousin's guilty glances. Lochdubh protected its own, even when they didn't like each other. Near the hotel, a group of tourists stood under the eaves, complaining about the weather. Hamish slipped past them and glanced through the window. Mrs. Dalrymple sat at a corner table, writing something on a small notepad. She looked up once, meeting his gaze. Her expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. Another piece, Hamish thought. Before he could enter, a familiar voice cut across the square. "Macbeth!" Blair marched toward him, Anderson trailing behind like a nervous spaniel. Blair's coat was too small across the shoulders, and the damp had made his hair curl in unflattering tufts. "We've had a report," Blair announced loudly, ensuring an audience. "Morag MacRae has been sighted in Dingwall, alive and well." Hamish felt a small, dry amusement flicker through him. "Who reported it?" "A reliable source," Blair snapped. "A man at the bus depot." Hamish tilted his head. "Did he speak to her?" "He saw her back." Hamish kept his face blank. "Many folk have backs." Anderson cleared his throat nervously. Blair shot him a glare. "Daviot wants this settled quickly. We can't afford the embarrassment of a wild goose chase." "It's not a wild goose," Hamish said. "Morag wouldn't wear those cracked boots to walk to Dingwall. She wouldn't wear them at all, unless she had no choice." Blair's face reddened. "Are you calling me a liar, Macbeth?" Hamish met his eyes calmly. "No, I'm saying someone else is lying to you." Blair puffed like an angry kettle. "You'll agree with the official report, or you'll regret it." Hamish said nothing. Silence bothered Blair more than argument. When the inspector stormed off, Anderson gave Hamish a small apologetic shrug before hurrying after him. Hamish turned back toward the loch. Lugs pressed against his leg, sensing tension. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. "It's an old mess, whatever this is." He walked home slowly, letting the cold air sting his cheeks. By the time he reached his cottage, his thoughts had begun aligning. Someone had taken Morag's boots to create a trail. Someone with a reason to hide something from decades of gossip, and someone who knew the sisters well enough to fear what they might reveal. Inside the cottage, Hamish lit the peat fire. It crackled to life reluctantly, sending the familiar smell of smoke curling around the room. Lugs settled near the hearth, paws twitching. Hamish stood by the window, watching the fog bow against the hills. Morag had carried a great burden. Someone else carried a greater one now, the burden of being found out, and Hamish would find them. Rain had settled over Lochdubh like a heavy quilt by the time Hamish Macbeth stepped out of his cottage the next morning. Not a lively, wind-driven highland rain, but the slow, weary sort that dripped from eaves and blurred the edges of the hills. It suited his mood too well. The village felt smaller under weather like this, its secrets closer to the surface. Lugs trotted beside him, tail low, glancing up at Hamish now and again, as if urging him on. The dog hated the creeping damp that worked its way into his fur, but he tolerated it for Hamish's sake. They made their way down the lane toward the hotel first. If Morag's disappearance and Elspeth's death were tied to outsiders, the hotel was where the thread began. Inside, the hotel lounge smelled of damp coats, stale tea, and the faint citrus scent the owners used to fight the mustiness. A tall woman sat near the window, her posture straight, as if she'd been raised at finishing schools. She wore a tailored coat and had the polished look of someone who ironed her napkins for fun. Lugs froze the moment he saw her, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Hamish placed a calming hand on his back. "Mrs. Dalrymple?" She looked up. Her expression was polite, but her eyes flicked, quick, assessing. "Constable Macbeth, isn't it? How dreadful about that poor woman. Lochdubh seems such a quiet place, but one never knows what tragedy hides beneath the surface." She spoke like someone who had practiced being sympathetic. Hamish sat opposite her. "You told Patel you were researching family history." "Yes," she said, with a quick smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "My late husband had ancestral connections here. I wanted to confirm a few things. Folks say they saw you near the MacRae croft, more than once." Her fingers tightened on the handle of her teacup, I may have walked past, Constable. It's a village. Everything is near everything else. And you spoke to the sisters? She hesitated. Once. They were chatty. I didn't stay long. Hamish watched her closely, keeping his own expression mild. Lugs' growl deepened, barely a thread of sound, but enough to make Mrs. Dalrymple pull her feet back. I do hope you find the other sister, she said, for the village's sake. Hamish stood. If you remember anything else, anything at all, let me know. She nodded, but her posture remained rigid until he and Lugs were well out the door. Outside, the rain was heavier. Lugs shook himself vigorously, then nudged Hamish's knee with the tip of his nose. Aye, lad, Hamish murmured. I don't like her either. The next stop was Angus MacLean's croft at the far end of Lochdubh. The walk took Hamish along a winding track lined with low stone walls slick with moss. By the time he reached the croft, the clouds hung so low they brushed the tops of the hills. Angus himself answered the door, eyes narrowed under thick brows. Hamish, he grunted, if this is about the sheep again, I swear. It's about the MacRaes, Hamish said. Angus's scowl deepened, then twisted into something closer to fear. I've nothing to do with that. You argued with them last week, Hamish reminded him gently. Angus muttered a curse and stepped aside. Come in then. No use shouting at each other in the rain. The interior was warm, the peat fire giving off a comforting glow despite the room's dimness. Lugs flopped down gratefully near the hearth, shaking droplets onto the rug. Angus busied himself with putting the kettle on, though his movements were clipped. They always meddled, he said abruptly. 40 years they've been poking their noses where they didn't belong. And yet, Hamish said softly, you look frightened, not angry. Angus froze, kettle in hand. They said they'd tell what they ken. Those were Morag's words. She said it while looking at me, like she could see through my skull. What did she mean? I don't know, Angus insisted. But I didn't harm them. I swear it on my mother's grave. Hamish believed him. Angus MacLean was many things. Grouchy, stubborn, tight-fisted, but not violent, and not a liar when fear had stripped him down to blunt honesty. Leaving Angus behind, Hamish made his way back toward the village proper. The rain softened into a mist again, a shifting curtain that swallowed sound. He stopped near the kirk to speak with the minister's wife, Mrs. Ogilvy, who was bustling from the hall with a stack of hymn sheets, her face pinched with worry. Oh, Hamish, she said, before he even spoke. I told my husband we should cancel the prayer meeting. No one's in the right frame of mind. You spoke with the MacRae sisters recently? Her mouth tightened. They knew something about my son's debts. They hinted at it after service last Sunday. I prayed they'd keep quiet, but you know how they were. Did they threaten to tell anyone? They never said it outright, she swallowed. But they knew. They always knew. Hamish watched her face. Embarrassment. Fear of scandal, not guilt. He moved on, stopping next near the harbour, where Callum Boyd, the young fisher, with more muscles than sense, was cleaning a net under the overhang. Callum avoided Hamish's gaze, which immediately drew it. You had words with Elspeth, Hamish said quietly. Callum swore and scrubbed harder. She was spreading talk about me pinching bait from Rory's shed. I never touched it, but she said she'd heard it from a reliable source, which meant she saw it firsthand, Hamish said. Callum's face flushed. All right, maybe I took a little, but I'd have returned it, and I didn't lay a finger on her. I just told her to mind her own business. Hamish nodded. Callum's shame was real, but his fear was small and personal, not the kind attached to murder. Near the post office, Mrs. Gallagher was sweeping her doorstep with the aggression of someone imagining each stroke was directed at a neighbour. She glared at Hamish as he approached. You'll want to ask if I know anything, she said. I do not. What did the MacRaes know about you? Hamish asked gently. She stopped sweeping. Plenty, but nothing worth killing over. He left her bristling and walked to Patel's shop, where Patel's visiting cousin Rajiv was rearranging tins on a high shelf. Rajiv offered Hamish an apologetic smile. I shouldn't have overheard, he said, before Hamish could ask anything. They were talking in the back room 2 days ago, something about a woman at the hotel and an old family problem. I didn't understand. Did they see you? I don't think so. Hamish thanked him. The young man seemed genuinely unsettled, but not dangerous. Everywhere Hamish went, he found tension, small fractures in the villagers' usual rhythms. They were defensive, embarrassed, protective of their secrets. The MacRae sisters had been the village's accidental confessional. Without them, old truths rattled inside people's heads like loose coins. Unfortunately, Blair was making it worse. Hamish found him outside the church hall, red-faced, shouting at the minister for obstructing a police inquiry. Anderson hovered behind him, nodding like a toy dog on a dashboard. "You're frightening folk," Hamish said quietly as he approached. "I'm doing my job, Macbeth," Blair snapped. "Something you might consider trying." Hamish kept his voice mild. "Folk talk more when you speak softly." "Folk lie," Blair retorted. "Especially crofters and busybodies. I'll get the truth the proper way." His proper way involved accusing almost everyone of murder until they were too terrified to speak. Hamish left him to it and drifted through the village at his own pace, stopping for tea, chatting about hens and weather and broken fences. With each conversation, small details emerged. Half-remembered remarks the sisters had made, hints of someone visiting the croft, more than once whispers of Morag's growing anxiety. Piece by small piece, a picture formed. The MacRaes knew something someone desperately wanted, kept quiet. By late afternoon, the rain returned, pounding hard enough to drive everyone indoors. Hamish made his way back to the croft, drawn by a feeling he trusted more than any logic. The house sat hunched in the dim light, the mist thick around its stones. He stepped inside. The cold hit him like a wall. Lugs whined softly and stayed near the threshold, uneasy. Hamish moved through the clutter, scanning the room again. Something tugged at his attention. A worn writing desk pushed against the far wall. He pulled open the drawers. Paper scraps, old church bulletins, bills from years ago. But when he tugged the lower drawer, it stuck halfway. He knelt and peered behind it. There, wedged between the back panel and the wall, was a small notebook bound in cheap blue cardboard. Morag's diary. He eased it out and opened it carefully. Neat handwriting filled the pages. Weather notes, petty gossip, who had visited, who had annoyed her. Then near the end the last pages were missing, torn out cleanly, leaving only threads. Hamish closed the diary and stared at the torn edge. The small room seemed to tighten around him, the mist outside pressing against the windows, like a breath being held. Somebody had taken Morag's final words, and that somebody was still in Lochdubh. The fog had settled thick and low over Lochdubh, so dense that Hamish Macbeth could barely see the outline of his own fence when he stepped outside with Lugs. It was the kind of fog that dulled sound and softened the world until even familiar paths felt strange. Hamish drew his jacket close and breathed in the cold air, tinged with peat smoke, drifting from a distant croft fire. Lugs sniffed the ground anxiously, ears lifting at noises Hamish could not hear. "Easy, boy," Hamish murmured. "It's only weather, not witches." Though, given the way Lochdubh behaved under pressure, he would not have been surprised if the villagers whispered about witches by lunchtime. He returned inside and stoked the peat fire until it gave off a modest warmth. The diary he'd found behind Morag MacRae's drawer lay on the small table, its cheap blue cover already curling from age and damp. Hamish sat in his worn armchair, Lugs curling at his feet, and opened the fragile book. The first pages were exactly what he expected. Morag's daily observations, written with prim satisfaction and a touch of superiority. Hamish read entries about minor tiffs over who sang too loudly in the kirk choir, who had mispronounced psalm, and who had bought reduced sandwiches from Patel's shop in a suspiciously greedy manner. All of it useless, all of it painfully typical. Still, he read every word. Morag's mind was sharp, nosy, and relentless. She noticed details most people ignored, and she wrote them down with the earnestness of a schoolteacher recording misbehaviour. By the middle of the diary, a pattern began to emerge. We must speak soon. Old shame resurfacing. The truth about Dalrymples. Hamish paused at that one. Dalrymple. The name had come up before, Mrs. Dalrymple, with her polished coif and careful answers. a woman who smiled too easily and avoided his eyes. Morag had underlined the entry twice. He flipped through more recent pages, but the last section ended abruptly. The final sheets torn out, cleanly, purposefully. Lugs whined and nudged his leg. Hamish rubbed behind his ears. Aye, somebody took what mattered most. He closed the diary and stared into the fire, where thin flames licked quietly at the peat. His thoughts moved gently, never rushing, shapes forming slowly in the fog of his mind. People didn't tear pages out of diaries unless secrets were involved, and secrets, in Lochdubh, were dangerous currency. When the fog thinned a little past noon, Hamish walked to the hotel. It loomed out of the mist like a ship emerging from cloud, its windows glowing dimly through the grey. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish, and damp coats hung near the door. Priscilla, Halbert and Smythe sat by the lounge window, a slim figure in a light grey jumper, her posture impossibly perfect even when she was simply reading a book. She looked up when Hamish approached, her expression warming just enough to soften the coolness of her features. "Hamish," she said quietly, "you look tired." He shrugged. "Fog makes the whole village restless. Folk behave worse when they can't see clearly." She closed her book and rested her hands on it. Sometimes people behave worse when things become too clear. He knew she was speaking of more than weather, but Priscilla never pressed. She had her own way of understanding the village from a higher vantage point, never meddling, always aware. Hamish lowered himself into the chair opposite her. Morag kept a diary. The last pages are missing. She wrote something about the Dalrymple name. Priscilla's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Family matters in the Highlands can go back far," she said slowly. "Old claims, old shame. They can resurface in ways no one wants. You think it's connected? I think you should be careful." Her eyes met his, calm and direct. "People do foolish things when trying to bury the past." He nodded. Priscilla rarely spoke without reason. She knew something, or suspected something, but he wouldn't push her. Whatever passed between them had always been quiet, moments of understanding, not confessions. They spoke a few minutes more about the fog, the hotel guests, and the expected rain. Then Hamish stood. Priscilla offered a small, restrained smile. "Come back if you need anything," she said. He walked back into the mist with a warmth he pretended not to feel. The afternoon brought a fine drizzle, just enough to blur the outlines of the crofts and make the loch look like polished pewter. Hamish headed toward the harbour, where Callum Boyd was mending a torn net under the shelter of an overturned boat. The young fisher jumped when he saw Hamish. "I didn't do anything," Callum blurted. Hamish leaned against a post. "Nobody said you did?" Callum scrubbed a hand through his hair, sending droplets everywhere. "I argued with Elspeth. She was spreading gossip, said I'd been sneaking around Rory's boats. I only took one for a night. I needed it. He'd have lent it to me if I'd asked. Probably." "You shouted at her," Hamish said mildly. "Aye, but that's all. Swear on the loch." Callum looked genuinely panicked. "You have to believe me. I'd never hurt either of them." Hamish did believe him. Callum was impulsive, but not secretive enough to commit murder. His shame was too loud, too obvious. Hamish left him and walked toward the path leading to the MacRae croft. Mrs. Dalrymple was returning from the direction of Patel's shop, her umbrella held perfectly upright despite the slight wind. She stopped when Hamish greeted her. "Back to research?" Hamish asked lightly. She smiled in a polished way. "Just getting some biscuits. One needs comfort food in weather like this." Hamish watched her face. "I've been looking through Morag's diary. She wrote quite a bit." He hadn't mentioned any details. But Mrs. Dalrymple blanched. Just a flicker, but enough. "She knew the truth," the woman murmured. "Too much truth." Hamish's brow rose. "Did she now?" Mrs. Dalrymple's lips tightened as if she regretted the words. "I only meant gossip. Small things." Hamish let the moment hang, then nodded politely. "If you think of anything else she told you, do let me know." He walked away, leaving her standing rigid under her immaculate umbrella. Back in the village square, the atmosphere had thickened like the fog. Villagers huddled in doorways, muttering in low tones. A rumour was circulating. Lantern lights seen near the woods last night. Someone moving slowly, searching the ground. Hamish stopped near the post office, where Mrs. Wellington stood on the steps with a mug of tea. "You'll have heard," she said, voice tight with excitement, "that someone was out near the trees after midnight." "Aye," Hamish said calmly. "Saw the light myself, flickering, far off, someone hunting for something." "Torn diary pages," Hamish murmured. Mrs. Wellington's eyes sharpened. "You found something then?" Hamish didn't answer. Instead, he patted Lugs and walked past Patel's shop, where the warm scent of spices drifted out the open door. Gossip had turned the whole village into a hive of nervous speculation. Without the MacRae sisters to channel it, the rumours had become wild things. Dusk approached, turning the mist a bruised purple. Hamish took the path along the shore, wanting space to think. Lugs ranged ahead, tail stiff, nose to the ground. The loch lay still as slate, waves barely brushing the stones. Halfway along the path, Lugs froze. Hamish stopped instantly. "What is it, boy?" A figure stood ahead, half glimpsed through the swirling fog, not moving toward him, but standing very still, watching the water. Hamish walked forward slowly, careful not to startle. His boots crunched faintly on the damp stones. The figure shifted, as if spooked by the sound. Hamish called out gently, "Evening." No reply. Lugs growled, a low warning note. The figure turned, dissolving into mist so quickly it might have slipped through a gap in the air itself. One moment there, the next gone. Hamish reached the spot. No footprints on the stones, no sign of lingering presence, except a faint disturbance in the fog. He looked toward the woods, where the first strands of night were weaving through the branches. Someone was searching, someone afraid, and someone watching him just as carefully as he watched them. Morning crept into Lochdubh reluctantly, dragging a pale grey light behind it. The storm had passed in the night, but it left the village washed out and subdued, as though the rain had scrubbed away the familiar colours. Mist pooled low across the square, drifting in slow ribbons between cottages. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of his house, with Lugs close behind, the dog stopping now and again to sniff at puddles that reflected the dim sky. Hamish paused at the road. The cold air held the sharp smell of damp stone and peat smoke. It steadied him. He'd hardly slept. Morag MacRae's body kept appearing in his thoughts. Carefully placed, hands folded, the torn diary page whispering of shame and forgotten truths. Hamish's mind worked best walking in weather like this. The quiet let his thoughts move at their own pace, unhurried but sure. "We'll start at the kirk," he murmured to Lugs, who flicked his ears forward. The kirk stood on a small rise overlooking Lochdubh, its stone walls darkened by the night's rain. Hamish pushed the heavy door open, the hinges giving a faint groan. Inside, the air was cool and still, with the faint lingering smell of last Sunday's hymn books. The minister, Reverend Macpherson, was already there, straightening hymn sheets at the pulpit. He looked up, startled, then softened into a weary smile. "Hamish, I thought you'd be busy with all that's happened." Hamish removed his cap respectfully. "Aye, I'm afraid I need to see some records." The minister's eyes flickered with concern. "Old records? If you've no objection." Reverend Macpherson hesitated only a moment before nodding. Morag and Elspeth were fond of these shelves. He led Hamish to a small side room where the kirk kept its dusty trove: baptismal books, marriage registers, land records tied with string. Lugs sat obediently by the door, though his gaze followed Hamish with quiet alertness. Hamish set to work, flipping through pages with careful fingers. He scanned births, deaths, and all the tangled lines between families. The names blurred after a while: MacRae, Fraser, MacLean, Ross, until one thread tightened: Dalrymple, except the entries were older than expected, tucked beneath notes written in another hand. He found a baptism marked with an asterisk, beside it a name that should not have been hidden: Isla MacRae, illegitimate. Mother, Anne MacRae. Father, unrecorded. Another note below: later fostered by distant relative, name altered. Hamish leaned back, breath stilling. Anne MacRae, a cousin of Morag and Elspeth, dead for decades. And the child? Isla. But later moved, renamed and folded into a different lineage. Another record deeper in the pile revealed the rest. Marriage, Isla MacRae, recorded as Isla Dalrymple. Mrs. Dalrymple wasn't a Dalrymple by blood. She was a buried branch of the MacRae family. Hamish rubbed his forehead. So that was it. An old shame hidden, a shifted name, a lineage that didn't match the polite family history the newcomer flaunted. And an inheritance, one that would revert to the MacRaes if truth came out. Morag had written about the rightful name. The sisters had found what they thought was juicy gossip, but gossip mixed with money was tinder. He closed the book softly. The minister watched him with a worried expression. "Find what you needed?" he asked. "Aye," Hamish said quietly, "though I'm not sure I wanted to." Reverend Macpherson nodded. "Be careful. Old things buried carry sharp edges." Outside, the mist had thickened, hanging low enough that even Lugs seemed uneasy. Hamish headed toward the village, letting instinct guide him. He made his way first to Mrs. Gallagher's house. She opened her door before he knocked, as though waiting to be summoned. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I saw something. You'll want to hear it." Hamish waited, giving her the respectful silence villagers needed if they were to speak honestly. "It was the night before Elspeth died," she said, voice lowered conspiratorially. "Fog thicker than your hair, but I saw a woman near the MacRae croft. Tall, proper coat, umbrella, even though it wasn't raining yet." Hamish nodded. "Mrs. Dalrymple?" "Aye," she sniffed. "Thought she was too lovely by half. Never trusted folk who walk like they own the village." Her eyesight wasn't perfect, but her instincts about people rarely wavered. Mrs. Dalrymple had lied. Again. Hamish thanked her and moved on. By the time he reached Angus MacLean's croft, the mist had started to lift, though the hills were still smudged with damp. Angus answered the door, wearing his usual scowl, though it faltered when he saw Hamish. "I told you I had nothing to do with the sisters' business," Angus said. "I know," Hamish replied gently, "but Morag confided something to you, something about someone losing money." Angus shifted. "Aye, she said someone would lose a fortune if something came out. I didn't ask more, didn't want to get tangled in their nonsense." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Thought it was another daft rumour. Didn't think it'd get them killed." His voice cracked slightly at the last word. Angus MacLean had a temper, but he wasn't unfeeling. Hamish clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "You told me what I needed." As he walked away, the pieces settled further. Mrs. Dalrymple's polished front hid the truth. She wasn't just researching family history. She was protecting it. Protecting her claim to something she'd built her identity upon. And the sisters, in their enthusiasm for mischief, had threatened that. Back in the square, Patel waved Hamish into the shop with unusual urgency. "Hamish! Something strange!" Rajiv, Patel's cousin, stood beside him, holding a dripping wet jacket. "I saw Callum last night," Rajiv said, carrying a sack over his shoulder, heading toward the woods. Hamish's pulse quickened. "What time?" "Late, after midnight." "And did he say why?" Rajiv shook his head. "He avoided me, looked guilty." Before suspicion could take hold, Patel leaned in. "You should tell him." Rajiv flushed. "It was whiskey, smuggled. He confessed when I confronted him just now. Said he didn't want his mother to know." Hamish relaxed fractionally. "Aye, that's more like Callum." Another red herring, but part of the puzzle nonetheless. The afternoon crept in with heavy clouds, and a drizzle so fine it felt like breath against the skin. Hamish walked slowly down to the loch, Lugs trotting at his heel. He stopped at the water's edge, watching the faint ripples against the stones. Names mattered in the Highlands. Pride mattered, and shame lingered long after the original sin. He now understood the motive. A name stolen, a reputation built on the illusion of belonging to a better family. Inheritance lines that would unravel if the truth surfaced, and two nosy sisters who didn't know when to stop digging. But Hamish lacked the final proof, those missing diary pages, the exact words Morag wrote before someone tore them out. A gull's cry echoed across the loch. Lugs pricked his ears, then looked toward the path leading back to the hotel. Hamish followed his gaze. The storm arrived before dawn, rolling over Lochdubh with the slow, determined weight of something that intended to stay. Rain hammered the rooftops, streamed down window panes, and turned every path into a slick ribbon of mud. Hamish Macbeth stood at his door, with Lugs pressed anxiously against his leg, watching lightning flash over the black surface of the loch. "A bad morning for walking," Hamish murmured. Lugs gave a soft whine, agreement, but also insistence. The dog had paced half the night, unsettled. Something had pulled at him, that uncanny awareness Lugs seemed to possess whenever danger hovered too close to the village. Hamish pulled on his coat, an old waterproof that had lost much of its truth to the name. "All right, lad, we'll go." The wind shoved at them as soon as they stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth, churned peat, and distant heather crushed under the weight of rain. Hamish set off toward the woods, letting Lugs lead. The dog kept his nose close to the ground, zigzagging through puddles with determination. Hamish trusted him completely. They reached the trees, the branches dripping steadily. The earth churned into a mess of impressions. Boot prints, dragged marks, something heavier pressed down into mud. Hamish crouched and examined what remained. The rain had obscured much of it, but something lingered beneath the wash, deeper indentations alongside a lighter set. Someone had supported someone else. Someone had led someone weakened, or unwilling, into the woods. Lugs tugged sharply, nearly pulling Hamish off balance. The dog bolted toward the loch edge, barking once, sharply. Hamish's breath caught as he followed. There, where the reeds bowed under the rain, lay Morag MacRae. She was positioned carefully on her back, hands folded on her chest. Her eyes were closed, her hair plastered to her forehead. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no torn clothing, just stillness. Stillness that did not match the violence of the storm. "Oh, Morag," Hamish whispered. He knew at once that she hadn't walked here herself. Morag MacRae, who had spent her whole life complaining about draughts and wet socks, would never have wandered into the woods during a storm. Exposure had killed her, but someone had placed her here to let the weather finish the job. Hamish crouched beside her, rain dripping from his nose, his coat, his hair. Lugs pressed against his side, shivering, not from cold, but from unease. Gently, Hamish brushed wet leaves away from Morag's sleeve. Something pale clung to the wool, threads, thin and smooth, unlike anything Morag would have worn, cotton or linen. Hamish rubbed the fibres between his fingers. Hotel linen came to mind. That polished woman in the hotel, with her careful answers, came to mind too. He glanced around. The lake lapped quietly against the shore, its surface broken only by occasional gusts of wind. The storm muffled the world, drowned the sound of village life. No one else was out, no one but Lugs and himself. He stood slowly. "We'll need to tell them," he said, though dread settled in his stomach. The discovery moved through Lochdubh like a cold current. Word spread before Hamish reached the square. Villagers emerging from their homes in small clusters, faces pale with shock. Even those who disliked the MacRae sisters seemed shaken, as though their absence had robbed the village of a strange but essential pillar. Mrs. Gallagher stood stiffly, with her arms crossed. "Terrible," she said, voice sharp with nerves. "Just terrible." The Curry sisters cried openly, curlers bobbing. At Patel's shop, folk huddled under the awning, whispering in low, fearful tones. Lochdubh's gossip network, so quick to fuel scandal, had gone hesitant, subdued, as if afraid to speak too loudly, lest the storm overhear. Then Blair arrived. He barreled into the crowd, shouting before he even saw the body. All right, no need for dramatics. Where is she?" Hamish led him to the loch. Blair stopped short at the sight of Morag, then immediately looked away, uncomfortable, not with death, but with responsibility. "Wandered off in grief," Blair said briskly, waving at Anderson. "Obvious. Nothing to investigate." Hamish stared at him. "Morag didn't wander anywhere in this weather." "Macbeth," Blair snapped. "You are not going to invent trouble because you can't handle a simple case." "It's not a case," Hamish said quietly. "It's a death." Blair flushed. "Same thing. And this death is natural." "Nothing about it is natural," Hamish replied. But Blair had already turned away, barking orders that made no sense, ordering Anderson to take photographs with a camera that barely worked, instructing villagers to stand back, though the rain washed away every trace anyway. Hamish stepped away from Blair's noise and opened Morag's coat gently. Her pockets were usually stuffed with scraps, notes, receipts, sweet wrappers. Today only one thing remained, a piece of paper charred along the edges, as if someone had tried to burn it hurriedly and failed. Hamish unfolded it carefully. A few words were visible. The girl born in shame. The rightful name. He felt a chill colder than the rain. Old scandal, old family chains, and the Dalrymple name hovering once again. He slipped the fragment into his pocket before Blair could see it. The storm worsened as the afternoon deepened. Phone lines flickered, then died. The roads turned to slow-moving streams. Folk stayed indoors with cups of tea and curtains drawn, as if fearing what else might be found. Hamish walked to the hotel. The lounge felt warm after the rain, but tension lay over it, like a second layer of fog. Mrs. Dalrymple sat by the window again, hands wrapped tightly around a cup she had not touched. Hamish approached her. "I found Morag." "Yes, I heard," she said, too quickly. Hamish studied her face. Rain battered the windows behind him. "Did you bring extra linens to your room 2 nights ago?" Her eyes flashed briefly. "I don't see how that concerns you." "Did you?" She swallowed. "Yes, the hotel ones were scratchy." Hamish said nothing. Letting silence speak had always been more effective than questioning. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips trembled as she looked away. "I did nothing wrong," she whispered. Hamish nodded once. "If you remember anything else, you know where to find me." When he stepped back into the storm, he felt the cold sink into his bones. Lugs pressed against him for comfort. "Home, lad," Hamish said softly. "We need to think." Walking through rain was one of the few things that cleared Hamish's mind. By the time he reached his cottage, he had the shape of a truth he didn't yet understand. Inside, the cottage felt almost cosy, despite its worn edges. Hamish fed the fire with fresh peat, then sank into his chair. Lugs lay with his head on Hamish's knee, eyes following the flames. Rain battered the windows in rhythmic gusts, making the world outside feel far away. Hamish pulled out the burned fragment of diary page and read the words again. The girl born in shame. The rightful name, Dalrymple. Priscilla's warning drifted back to him. Old scandals, old claims, old relatives, with much to lose. Morag and Elspeth had stumbled into something dark but delicate. Someone desperate enough to burn diary pages. Someone frightened enough to lead an old woman into the woods and let the weather finish what they couldn't bear to do themselves. In the flickering firelight, the pieces began to align. Fear, pride, inheritance, identity. Hamish rubbed Lug's head gently. "We're close, lad," he murmured. "Closer than they'd like." Outside, the storm rumbled again. Deeper this time, like a warning echoing across the hills. Inside, Hamish felt the soft shift of clarity, the faint spark before understanding. Tomorrow, the village would wake to grief, suspicion, and whispers, and Hamish Macbeth would be ready. The storm arrived before dawn, rolling over Lochdubh with the slow, determined weight of something that intended to stay. Rain hammered the rooftops, streamed down window panes, and turned every path into a slick ribbon of mud. Hamish Macbeth stood at his door, with Lugs pressed anxiously against his leg, watching lightning flash over the black surface of the loch. "A bad morning for walking," Hamish murmured. Lugs gave a soft whine, agreement but also insistence. The dog had paced half the night, unsettled. Something had pulled at him, that uncanny awareness Lugs seemed to possess whenever danger hovered too close to the village. Hamish pulled on his coat, an old waterproof that had lost much of its truth to the name. "All right, lad, we'll go." The wind shoved at them as soon as they stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth, churned peat, and distant heather crushed under the weight of rain. Hamish set off toward the woods, letting Lugs lead. The dog kept his nose close to the ground, zigzagging through puddles with determination. Hamish trusted him completely. They reached the trees, the branches dripping steadily. The earth churned into a mess of impressions. Boot prints, dragged marks, something heavier pressed down into mud. Hamish crouched and examined what remained. The rain had obscured much of it, but something lingered beneath the wash, deeper indentations alongside a lighter set. Someone had supported someone else. Someone had led someone weakened, or unwilling, into the woods. Lugs tugged sharply, nearly pulling Hamish off balance. The dog bolted toward the loch edge, barking once, sharply. Hamish's breath caught as he followed. There, where the reeds bowed under the rain, lay Morag MacRae. She was positioned carefully on her back, hands folded on her chest. Her eyes were closed, her hair plastered to her forehead. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no torn clothing, just stillness. Stillness that did not match the violence of the storm. "Oh, Morag," Hamish whispered. He knew at once that she hadn't walked here herself. Morag MacRae, who had spent her whole life complaining about drafts and wet socks, would never have wandered into the woods during a storm. Exposure had killed her, but someone had placed her here to let the weather finish the job. Hamish crouched beside her, rain dripping from his nose, his coat, his hair, Lugs pressed against his side, shivering. Not from cold, but from unease. Gently, Hamish brushed wet leaves away from Morag's sleeve. Something pale clung to the wool, threads, thin and smooth, unlike anything Morag would have worn. Cotton or linen. Hamish rubbed the fibres between his fingers. Hotel linen came to mind. That polished woman in the hotel, with her careful answers, came to mind too. He glanced around. The lake lapped quietly against the shore, its surface broken only by occasional gusts of wind. The storm muffled the world, drowned the sound of village life. No one else was out, no one but Lugs and himself. He stood slowly. "We'll need to tell them," he said, though dread settled in his stomach. The discovery moved through Lochdubh like a cold current. Word spread before Hamish reached the square. Villagers emerging from their homes in small clusters, faces pale with shock. Even those who disliked the MacRae sisters seemed shaken, as though their absence had robbed the village of a strange but essential pillar. Mrs. Gallagher stood stiffly, with her arms crossed. "Terrible," she said, voice sharp with nerves. "Just terrible." The Curry sisters cried openly, curlers bobbing. At Patel's shop, folk huddled under the awning, whispering in low, fearful tones. Lochdubh's gossip network, so quick to fuel scandal, had gone hesitant, subdued, as if afraid to speak too loudly lest the storm overhear. Then Blair arrived. He barreled into the crowd, shouting before he even saw the body. All right, no need for dramatics. Where is she?" Hamish led him to the loch. Blair stopped short at the sight of Morag, then immediately looked away, uncomfortable not with death, but with responsibility. "Wandered off in grief," Blair said briskly, waving at Anderson. "Obvious. Nothing to investigate." Hamish stared at him. "Morag didn't wander anywhere in this weather." "Macbeth," Blair snapped. "You are not going to invent trouble because you can't handle a simple case." "It's not a case," Hamish said quietly. "It's a death." Blair flushed. "Same thing. And this death is natural." "Nothing about it is natural," Hamish replied. But Blair had already turned away, barking orders that made no sense, ordering Anderson to take photographs with a camera that barely worked, instructing villagers to stand back, though the rain washed away every trace anyway. Hamish stepped away from Blair's noise and opened Morag's coat gently. Her pockets were usually stuffed with scraps. Notes, receipts, sweet wrappers. Today only one thing remained, a piece of paper charred along the edges, as if someone had tried to burn it hurriedly and failed. Hamish unfolded it carefully. A few words were visible. The girl born in shame. The rightful name. He felt a chill colder than the rain. Old scandal, old family chains, and the Dalrymple name hovering once again. He slipped the fragment into his pocket before Blair could see it. The storm worsened as the afternoon deepened. Phone lines flickered, then died. The roads turned to slow-moving streams. Folk stayed indoors with cups of tea and curtains drawn, as if fearing what else might be found. Hamish walked to the hotel. The lounge felt warm after the rain, but tension lay over it like a second layer of fog. Mrs. Dalrymple sat by the window again, hands wrapped tightly around a cup she had not touched. Hamish approached her. "I found Morag." "Yes, I heard," she said too quickly. Hamish studied her face. Rain battered the windows behind him. "Did you bring extra linens to your room 2 nights ago?" Her eyes flashed briefly. "I don't see how that concerns you." "Did you?" She swallowed. "Yes, the hotel ones were scratchy." Hamish said nothing. Letting silence speak had always been more effective than questioning. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips trembled as she looked away. I did nothing wrong, she whispered. Hamish nodded once. If you remember anything else, you know where to find me. When he stepped back into the storm, he felt the cold sink into his bones. Lugs pressed against him for comfort. Home, lad, Hamish said softly. We need to think. Walking through rain was one of the few things that cleared Hamish's mind. By the time he reached his cottage, he had the shape of a truth he didn't yet understand. Inside, the cottage felt almost cosy, despite its worn edges. Hamish fed the fire with fresh peat, then sank into his chair. Lugs lay with his head on Hamish's knee, eyes following the flames. Rain battered the windows in rhythmic gusts, making the world outside feel far away. Hamish pulled out the burned fragment of diary page and read the words again. The girl born in shame, the rightful name, Dalrymple. Priscilla's warning drifted back to him. Old scandals, old claims, old relatives, with much to lose. Morag and Elspeth had stumbled into something dark but delicate. Someone desperate enough to burn diary pages. Someone frightened enough to lead an old woman into the woods and let the weather finish what they couldn't bear to do themselves. In the flickering firelight, the pieces began to align. Fear, pride, inheritance, identity. Hamish rubbed Lugs's head gently. We're close, lad, he murmured. Closer than they'd like. Outside, the storm rumbled again. Deeper this time, like a warning echoing across the hills. Inside, Hamish felt the soft shift of clarity, the faint spark before understanding. Tomorrow, the village would wake to grief, suspicion, and whispers, and Hamish Macbeth would be ready. Maybe she'll slip again, he murmured. Folk do when they've built their life on lies. He turned toward the village, hands in his pockets, rain dampening his hair. As he walked, the storm clouds thickened again over the hills. Lochdubh's breath seemed to still. Proof existed somewhere, and whoever held it was becoming desperate. The morning broke with a thin, watery light that barely pushed through the low clouds, clinging to Lochdubh's roofs. The rain had lessened to a faint drizzle, a tired sort of weather that left the village glistening but subdued. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside his cottage, pulling his coat tight as Lugs padded after him, shaking droplets from his ginger-flecked fur. It was a morning for quiet thinking, the kind that made Hamish's mind click into place. All the threads he had gathered, the torn diary pages, the burned scrap, the shift in Mrs. Dalrymple's voice, whenever she spoke of the sisters, sat in his head like puzzle pieces waiting for the final turn. Time we gave them a wee nudge, Hamish murmured. Lugs lifted his head, tail twitching. He sensed something in Hamish's tone. Purpose. Hamish began his walk through the village, letting the drizzle bead on his hair. Lochdubh moved slowly in weather like this. The Curry sisters peered from behind lace curtains. Patel shuffled crates outside his shop. Callum Boyd, head down, dragged a net across the shore stones, pretending not to look over his shoulder as Hamish passed. Hamish's plan was simple enough. The best traps were. He greeted each villager with quiet politeness, easing into conversation, dropping the same line with casual shrugging ease. Aye, word from Strathbane is the missing diary pages have turned up, he would say, as though it were no more interesting than misdelivered mail. Safe in their station now. Blair says he's handing them over to Daviot. The reactions varied. Mrs. Gallagher gasped with loud approval. Patel narrowed his eyes, trying to guess what might be on those pages. The Curry sisters whispered their preferences aloud, that Morag had written confessions, prophecies, or a list of people who'd wronged them, which was longer than the Kirk registry. Hamish never confirmed nor denied any speculation. He just let the rumour settle into the village like mist rolling off the hills. He knew Lochdubh. Gossip moved with a speed that embarrassed wind, and in this case, he needed it to drift toward the hotel like slow-burning peat smoke. By midday, it had. From the road, Hamish saw the first sign. Mrs. Dalrymple emerged from the hotel doors with brisk steps, her shoulders held in unnatural tension. She clutched a folded newspaper she wasn't reading. Her polished composure didn't slip, but something in her eyes shifted, nervous and brittle, like porcelain touched by frost. Lugs growled softly beside Hamish, not loudly enough to draw attention, just enough for Hamish to know the dog sensed what he did. Thought so, Hamish muttered. For the next hour, he positioned himself in usual places: a bench near the harbour, Patel's doorway, the church hall steps, quietly observing the small cracks forming around Mrs. Dalrymple's polite facade. She didn't walk toward the croft paths anymore. Her once constant strolls near the moors had ceased completely. She lingered inside the hotel, only emerging with sharp snaps at the staff and returning quickly, as though rain might expose her. By mid-afternoon, she had ordered the hotel maid to fetch her suitcase from storage. Hamish decided the moment had come. He approached the hotel slowly, letting the drizzle dampen his hair. The lobby was quiet except for soft music playing from the old radio behind the desk. Mrs. Dalrymple was there, speaking curtly to the receptionist about her bill. Her suitcase sat by her feet, far earlier than any guest in Lochdubh ever packed. When she saw Hamish, she stiffened. "Mrs. Dalrymple," Hamish said, "I wondered if you had a moment." She smiled with a tightness that had nothing to do with friendliness. "Constable Macbeth, I'm rather busy, leaving tomorrow." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so soon?" "Just a change of plans," she said briskly. "Of course, I'd still appreciate a few minutes. Routine follow-up." Her jaw clenched. "If it's absolutely necessary." He gestured toward her room. After a moment, she relented and led the way upstairs, her steps quick and clipped. Lugs followed silently, muscles taut under his ginger coat. Mrs. Dalrymple unlocked her door and swung it open. The room was as orderly as she was, everything folded, polished, placed with care, but Lugs abruptly stopped at the threshold, a low growl rising deep in his chest. His stare fixed on a dresser drawer. Hamish's brows lifted. "Is something troubling him?" she asked too quickly. "Oh, he's usually friendly," Hamish said softly. "Only growls when something smells wrong." Her face tightened. Dogs are unpredictable. Hamish drifted toward the drawer with an aimless air, as though bored. "Mind if I take a look? Routine check, Blair's orders." He was lying, and she likely knew it. But fear had softened her resistance. She didn't object. Hamish pulled the drawer open. Inside was a neat row of scarves, and beneath them, a layer of damp grey ash. Hamish lifted the scarf carefully, revealing the small pile of burned paper crumbs. Edges curled, centre blackened. The ash smelled faintly of damp wool, and something sharper: fear. "This looks odd," Hamish said gently. Mrs. Dalrymple's breath trembled. "Those were personal letters." "Burned personal letters," Hamish murmured. He kept his tone sympathetic, not accusing. "Folk pushed harder when you pushed gently." She pressed her hands together, fingers whitening. "They weren't important. Important enough to hide, dear." Mrs. Dalrymple's composure, long polished and fiercely guarded, cracked like thin ice. Her shoulders sagged. A tear formed in her eye but didn't fall. She wasn't the type to weep. "I didn't mean for anything to happen," she whispered. "I only wanted them to stop." Hamish said nothing. Silence worked like the spare key he always kept under the flower pot. Quiet, useful, and opening doors folk didn't realise they'd locked. Mrs. Dalrymple sank onto the edge of the bed. "I confronted them, the sisters. They'd found something about my past, my family." She swallowed. "My mother never spoke of it. I didn't even know the full story until recently. But if the truth came out, I would lose everything." Hamish sat in the chair opposite her, posture relaxed. "They threatened to tell you?" "They hinted. They loved hinting." Her voice sharpened briefly, then softened again. "I went to the croft. I begged them to keep quiet. Elspeth pushed me away. I reached for her sleeve. She slipped." Her breath quickened. "It was an accident." Hamish watched her carefully. He saw the lie sitting in her words like a weight she didn't know how to hide. Maybe she hadn't pushed Elspeth in anger. Maybe she had. But she feared disgrace more than prison, more than truth, more than anything else. "And Morag?" Hamish asked quietly. Mrs. Dalrymple's gaze hardened. "She came later, saw her sister on the ground. She screamed. I told her she had to listen, that I would be ruined if she didn't help me, but she ran." Her voice shook. "I followed. She wouldn't stop. The storm was terrible. When I found her again, she closed her eyes. I panicked. I didn't mean for her to die." Hamish's heart squeezed. Morag in the rain, terrified, running blindly through the storm. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered, I placed her by the loch. I thought it would look peaceful. Hamish let the silence settle again. Rain tapped softly against the window. Lugs lay at his feet, gaze pinned on the woman with quiet certainty. You understand, she whispered, leaning forward. This can ruin a life. My position, my reputation. Hamish stood slowly. Aye, he said, voice gentle. I understand very well. Her eyes brightened with hope, but Hamish's expression remained unreadable. He opened the door. I'll be back soon. Don't leave the hotel. A tremor ran through her. Are you arresting me? Hamish shook his head. Not yet. He stepped out into the corridor. The air felt colder here, colder than the rain outside. Lugs stayed close, leaning against Hamish's leg, as though confirming the truth Hamish already knew. She feared scandal more than she feared justice, and fear made people dangerous. The next chapter of the story had already begun. Morning slipped quietly into Lochdubh, pale and colourless, as though unsure whether the village was ready for light again. A faint veil of mist clung to the loch, softening its edges, and the air held that damp chill that seeped into bone rather than skin. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside with Lugs trotting at his heel, the dog unusually subdued. Perhaps he sensed the way the village felt, tender, bruised, but beginning to stir again. Hamish drew in a breath of the cold air. It steadied him. Today would be difficult, but the truth often was. He walked slowly toward the hotel, boots brushing against gravel, slick with last night's rain. Lochdubh was already awake, the Curry sisters, huddled by their gate, whispering fiercely. Callum Boyd dragged nets across the jetty with exaggerated purpose. Mrs. Gallagher stood at her window, like a gargoyle of judgment, watching every movement. They all knew something was happening today. Hamish reached the hotel entrance and paused. Lugs nudged his leg gently, encouraging him. Aye, lad, Hamish murmured. Let's finish it. Inside, the hotel lobby smelled of damp coats and overbrewed tea. Mrs. Dalrymple sat in one of the armchairs, a suitcase placed neatly beside her. She looked crisp as always, hair pinned perfectly, posture straight, but her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. She had not slept. Fear rarely let people sleep. She stood quickly when Hamish entered. Constable Macbeth, she said, attempting calm. I hope this is brief. I have arrangements. Hamish nodded gently. Just a conversation, that's all. Her throat bobbed. In my room? No, here will do. She hesitated, then sat again, hands clasped in her lap, with faint tremors she tried to hide. Hamish took the chair opposite, Lugs settling at his feet, but keeping his gaze fixed on her, unblinking and steady. Hamish spoke with the softness of someone naming familiar weather. I've been piecing together what happened, not with accusations, just with care. She swallowed. I've told you what I can. You've told me what you wish were true, Hamish said calmly, but not what is. Her fingers tightened until her knuckles whitened. Hamish continued, voice steady as still water. You didn't plan to kill Elspeth, that's obvious. You came to the croft to beg. You didn't want your name, your birth revealed. Not after all the work you'd done becoming who you are now. A faint sound escaped her, half breath, half sob. They teased you, Hamish went on. Hinted they'd spread word. Maybe they wanted a reaction. Maybe they wanted to feel powerful. They pushed. You pushed back. I never meant... Her voice cracked, thin as wet paper. She slipped. Hamish nodded gently. Aye, I believe she fell. But then Morag came, and she wasn't the sort to listen before shouting. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes brimmed, but she blinked the tears back. She would never cry freely. Her pride wouldn't let her. Hamish's voice softened further. You panicked. You told Morag she could stop a scandal, that you'd claim she attacked you, or that you'd ruin another villager's name, something cruel enough to frighten her. Mrs. Dalrymple pressed a hand to her mouth. You told her to go, Hamish said, into the storm, away from the croft. You thought she'd only hide till you'd... Compose yourself. She wouldn't listen, Mrs. Dalrymple whispered. She ran. I chased after her. The rain was blinding. The wind... She shuddered. I lost her. When I found her again, she was sitting, shivering, but still alive. She said her sister was gone. She said she'd tell everything. Hamish kept still. No judgment. Just space for truth. Mrs. Dalrymple's breath quivered. I left her. I left her there. I thought she'd walk back. I thought she'd decide silence was easier. But she didn't make it, Hamish said softly. Mrs. Dalrymple finally let a tear fall. Just one. She wiped it quickly, ashamed. Panic does terrible things to folk, Hamish murmured. Not evil folk, just frightened ones. She closed her eyes. Are you going to arrest me? Hamish didn't answer yet. Instead he stood, walked to the phone on the hotel counter, and dialed the Strathbane station. The line crackled poorly. Davitt answered, crisp and political as ever. Hamish explained quietly, giving facts, not opinion. Davitt sighed loudly enough to rattle the receiver. Blair will handle it. Hamish's stomach sank, but he said only, Aye, sir. When he hung up, the front door burst open, letting in a gust of cold air and the muddy stomp of Chief Inspector Blair. Anderson followed closely, puffing like an overeager sheepdog. Blair strutted into the lobby with the swagger of someone convinced he was walking into triumph. Macbeth, he bellowed. Heard you finally done something useful. Mrs. Dalrymple recoiled at the sound of his voice. Blair puffed out his chest. Right then, where's the criminal? I'll take it from here. Davitt says, this is my collar. The villagers who'd gathered near the entrance rolled their eyes with synchronized weariness. Mrs. Gallagher even muttered, He's got the subtlety of a cow in a kirk. Hamish stepped aside quietly, letting Blair bluster past him. Blair jabbed a finger at Mrs. Dalrymple. You're under arrest for... He paused, searching for a word. Everything Macbeth just mumbled at Davitt. Hamish winced. Mrs. Dalrymple stood, dignity trembling but intact. May I collect my bag? No, Blair barked. Anderson will get it. Anderson tripped over his own feet, trying to obey. Mrs. Dalrymple looked at Hamish. For a moment her eyes held something like gratitude, mixed with sorrow. He hadn't humiliated her, hadn't shouted, hadn't made her shame a spectacle. Blair cuffed her unnecessarily, though not tightly. Right, off we go. Macbeth, don't touch anything. I'll be writing a report about how I solved this case. Patel, who had crept closer to observe, snorted. Solved? You didn't even hear the confession. Blair glared. Watch it. Mrs. Dalrymple was escorted out into the grey morning, her steps slow, her posture still strangely elegant, despite everything breaking around her. Villagers murmured. Some pitied her, some judged. All felt the ripple of damage that always followed truth in a small place. The door closed behind the Strathbane officers. Hamish exhaled, shoulders sinking. Lugs nudged his hand, sensing the weary ache beneath the quiet exterior. Hamish scratched behind his ears. The hotel receptionist approached. Constable, is it over? Hamish shook his head slightly. Aye and no. The village will settle, but not right away. Outside, Lochdubh moved cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the rawness in the air. The gossip network, stilled for days, began its slow hum again. Gentler this time, almost respectful. Even the Curry sisters whispered more softly than usual. Hamish stepped outside with Lugs, watching the loch ripple under the light breeze. Peace was returning, but it carried a bruise. Lochdubh always recovered, but never without a faint scar. He took a long breath. Come on, lad. Home. Lugs pressed against his leg, warm and solid. Hamish walked toward his cottage, feeling the weight of truth settle into the quiet spaces of the village. The world was restored, in its crooked Highland way, but the cost lingered, soft and melancholy, as the morning mist. Tomorrow would bring routine again. Gossip, tea, small quarrels, but today Lochdubh breathed carefully, and Hamish, familiar with such endings, kept walking. Snow came quietly to Lochdubh, the kind that drifted down without hurry, each flake turning lazily in the still air before settling on the rooftops. It softened the jagged lines of the hills, muted the loch's dark sheen, and wrapped the village in a hush so complete that even the gulls seemed to call more gently. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the road, leading toward the MacRae croft, Lugs moving at his side with a solemnity rare for him, paws crunching softly in the thin layer of snow. The croft looked smaller than usual, its stone walls dusted white, its chimney bare of smoke. Someone, likely Mrs. Gallagher or one of the Curry sisters, had closed the shutters. A few sprigs of heather lay on the front step, the beginnings of what would become a modest pile as the villagers made their rounds. It wasn't affection exactly. Morag and Elspeth had been more feared than loved, but they were Lochdubh folk, and Lochdubh looked after its own, even in death. Hamish stood at the gate for a long moment. Snow gathered in his hair and on the shoulders of his coat. Lugs sat beside him, without being asked, tail curled around his paws. They were a nuisance, Hamish murmured, but the place feels wrong without them. Lugs gave a small whiff of agreement. Hamish lifted the latch and walked up the short path. He didn't go inside. The croft felt like a sealed memory now, not to be disturbed. He only touched the door lightly, an absent gesture, almost a farewell, then turned back toward the village. Lochdubh had the air of a place recovering from a long-held breath. Folk who had avoided their neighbours during the worst of the fear now exchanged tentative greetings across snowy fences. Mrs. Gallagher swept her steps with more energy than necessary, as though righteous tidiness could ward off tragedy. The Curry sisters walked arm in arm, gossiping in lowered voices, still unable to quite believe the sisters, whose secrets had fueled half their conversations, would never spread another rumour. At Patel's shop, a lantern glowed in the window, illuminating shelves stocked neatly with tins and jars. Patel himself stood behind the counter, polishing it with unusual fervour. He looked up as Hamish entered. "Terrible business," he said softly, offering a bag of dog biscuits before Hamish even asked. "The whole village is rattled." Hamish nodded. "Aye, folk'll settle soon enough." Patel adjusted his glasses. "They will, but it won't be the same. They were part of the rhythm of things." Hamish managed a faint smile. "A loud part." "That too," Patel agreed, humour glinting briefly through his earnest expression. Hamish paid for the biscuits, exchanged a few quiet words about the weather, then stepped back into the soft swirl of snow. He passed the church hall, where Reverend Macpherson stood, adjusting the notice board, his breath forming little clouds in the cold. When he saw Hamish, he nodded, the kind of nod that carried sympathy without dramatics. Hamish raised a hand in return, but didn't stop. His feet were already turning toward home. The cottage welcomed him, with its familiar jumble. Boots by the door, a cushion sliding drunkenly from the armchair, half-read newspapers stacked unevenly on the table. He lit the peat fire, coaxing it to life with gentle patience until the flames licked at the air, casting amber light across the walls. Lugs curled into his usual place beside the hearth, nose resting near Hamish's boot. The quiet inside was warm but immense, stretching through the rooms like an uninvited guest. Hamish filled the kettle and set it on the stove. As he waited for the water to boil, he glanced at the window. Snow drifted steadily past, blurring the edges of the world. The kettle whistled, gentle and familiar. He brewed his tea, weak as always, and carried it to his armchair. He sat heavily, the fire crackling softly, and let the warmth seep into him. His thoughts drifted back to the sisters, not with anger, not even with irritation, but with a kind of weary affection. They had been meddlesome, sharp-tongued, relentless in their pursuit of every shred of gossip. But beneath their barbs lay a fierce attachment to the village, however misguided. "What do you think, Lugs?" Hamish said quietly. Lugs shifted, letting out a low sigh, and pressed his head against Hamish's foot. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "Folk are complicated." A knock sounded at the door, light, hesitant. Hamish stood and opened it to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe, a small basket held delicately in one gloved hand. Snowflakes clung to her hair like tiny pearls. "Hamish," she said softly, "I brought scones. Cook insisted." He stepped aside. "Come in. It's cold enough to freeze your eyelashes." She gave a faint smile and walked inside. Her presence altered the cottage subtly, made it feel tidier, or at least more observed. She placed the basket on the table and removed her gloves with precise movements. "How is everyone?" she asked, settling into the quieter tone Lochdubh adopted after grief. "Shaken," Hamish said, "but steadying. The village does that." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the fire. "You look tired." He shrugged. "Work. Priscilla nodded. It was a terrible thing, but you handled it with kindness. Hamish felt heat rise to his ears and busied himself pouring tea into two mismatched cups. Folk do daft, panicked things when cornered. Doesn't make it any easier to sort out. Priscilla accepted the cup, sitting with her usual composed grace. A silence spread between them, comfortable, if tinged with the slight awkwardness that always threaded their conversations. They'll talk, she said quietly. The villagers. They always do. About you too, she added. I overheard someone say you solved the case without fuss. Hamish huffed. Blair solved it, according to him. Priscilla's smile warmed a little. Lochdubh knows better. He met her eyes for a moment longer than intended. Something unspoken lingered there, soft and unreachable, like a candle flickering behind frost. I should go before the snow worsens, she said gently. Hamish walked her to the door. Thanks for the scones. She paused, looking past him toward the firelight. Take care, Hamish. He nodded. She stepped outside, her boots crunching softly as she walked away, snow settling on her hair once more. Hamish closed the door, the cottage sinking back into its familiar stillness. He returned to his chair, Lugs lifting his head in greeting before putting it back on Hamish's foot. The fire had settled into a quiet glow. Outside, the snow thickened, softening the landscape into a silent patchwork of white and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleated. The loch, unfazed by the weather, lapped gently against the shore. Hamish sipped his tea. It had gone lukewarm. Lochdubh would return to its usual routines soon enough. Its small wars, its grudges, its gossip. But tonight the village rested, its breath slow and deep beneath the hush of falling snow. Hamish felt the ache of loneliness, familiar as an old coat. But it didn't hurt sharply. Not tonight. It was softened by acceptance, by the fire's warmth, by Lugs's steady presence. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the quiet gather around him like another blanket. Outside, the snow drifted on. Inside, the fire crackled. And in the gentle space between them, Hamish Macbeth listened to the silence of his village, flawed, nosy, loyal, and wholly his.